Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Choice Hotels get you more for your money so you can maximize any road trip. Let's get real close to hear the maximum sizzle of Comfort Inn's free hot breakfast. Maximized. Check into more. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
What's worse than an ad interrupting your favorite music or podcast? That uninspired coffee you've been drinking while working, which is why Flavia is elevating your everyday coffee experience. Now you can enjoy cafe-quality beverages like coffee, tea, frothy lattes, and creamy hot chocolate made right in your home office, actual office, or wherever you want to upgrade your mug with bold, delicious flavors. Visit Flavia.com to shop the collection of machines and beverages now.
It's being called the 12-Day War, and it's already over. Israel versus Iran. The United States dropping the mother of all bombs on nuclear sites to try and shut it down. There was talk of regime change in Iran for a little while, but now that appears to be on hold. Hi, I'm Brian Lilly. Welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into Iran. What do we know? What is true? What is false? Will there be a regime change, and who would take over? And did the United States actually take out those nuclear facilities? And what about that prison that Israel struck? To answer questions on all of this, we're turning to Kaveh Shahrooz. He is a fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, native of Iran, and someone who knows issues well. Here's our conversation. Kaveh, what do we actually know about what's happening in Iran right now? We'll start with leadership and then talk about what's going on for the average person. But we know a lot of military leaders were taken out. We know a lot of IRGC people were taken out. Who's left in control, and how much control do they actually have?
That's a great question. Slowly things are coming into focus, and we're getting a better sense of what has happened after the Israeli and American strikes. So, for example, for quite a few days, it was unknown whether or not the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, was alive. We finally had proof of life yesterday through a video in which he looked, he looked like he'd aged a decade in the span of a few days, and it was a very shaky performance, but he's still alive. Some of the folks initially thought to be dead, like his key advisor or the leader of the Quds force, the sort of arm of the IRGC that deals with matters abroad. The initial thought was that they'd all been killed, but they're still alive. And yet still, we know for a fact that much of the upper echelons of the IRGC has been taken out. Members of the security apparatus, a lot of the nuclear scientists have been killed. So the Islamic regime still seems to be in charge. But in terms of how much control they can still exert, that remains to be seen. At the moment, I think what they're trying to do is assert control and show dominance. So what the regime has started to do is to engage in widespread arrests of well-known dissidents or even people that have been mildly critical of the regime. And I think I see all of that as an effort to just kind of reassert dominance and also send a message to everybody that we're still in charge and we're not going anywhere.
You had a post about one such leader arrested the other day, Hossein Ronagi. What should we know about him? We don't know a lot about. Most of us don't. You do. A lot about opposition movements. There was a time when they were growing in strength, and then they appeared to be cracked down on, about a decade ago. What is the state of opposition right now?
Regrettably, the state of the opposition is not great. So, we have heroic figures like the one you mentioned, Hossein Ronagi, who's been a critic of this regime inside the country for a number of years. He's incredibly courageous, continuously gets detained and tortured, and yet he still comes out every time and continues to criticize the regime. There are figures like this, truly heroic, courageous people, and obviously there's, an opposition force outside the country. But unfortunately, these forces have not been able to consolidate. They haven't been able to work together. There's still some very deep fractures in our opposition. And I think, frankly, one of the reasons the Islamic regime has been able to stay in power for so long is that its opposition, even though the numbers are great in total, they simply can't work together, and they often even work at cross purposes. And so the regime divides and conquers, and it really benefits from that fracture in the opposition.
So right now, the regime, as you say, trying to crack down on what remains. Are they looking for spies, traitors that they, as they might see them, who provided a lot of this information? The Israelis seem to have some very good intelligence on what to hit and where to hit.
Yeah, one of the things that the Islamic regime says is that they're looking for spies. And just the other day, actually, a couple of days ago, they executed a number of people very rapidly, moving them through the so-called judicial system and hanging them on the basis that these are spies. Now, anything that this regime says has to be taken with a grain of salt. This is a regime that often executes dissidents by calling them drug dealers, for example. So it would not surprise me at all if they took people that had no role in spying for Israel and calling them spies and killing them in the process. I don't think the unnamed people that they killed as spies were the ones that are giving them this very, very sensitive information. I mean, what Israel did on the first day of the attacks by taking out a number of IRGC figures, a number of nuclear scientists, this is not information that's available to low-level people. I mean, these people are heavily guarded. So it really must be somebody in the upper echelons, somebody or several people in the upper echelons of the regime that are working for the Mossad. This is a regime that's completely infiltrated, it seems. And I think for the foreseeable future, those that remain loyal to this regime are going to continue to hunt down for spies of the Mossad.
Well, given what you've been describing for the last several minutes, can this regime survive? We know that Donald Trump has said, look, I'm not here for regime change. I don't think he'd be unhappy if it did change, but he's not going to be the agent of that change. So does the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Ayatollah, the people around him, does it survive?
Good question. I mean, really, it depends on what day you ask me. If you were to ask me 2 or 3 days ago when the fighting was still happening and it looked like the Israelis were going to continue bombing control centers of the regime, I was thinking that this regime is about to fall. Now that the Israelis have basically been told by the U.S. to pull back and Donald Trump has changed his tune, it looks like the regime has a new lease on life. So whether or not it will survive is hard to predict. But here are some factors to consider. So I just mentioned a moment ago, this is a regime that's deeply infiltrated by Israeli intelligence. What that suggests to me is that there's not a ton of loyalty, there's not a ton of revolutionary zeal in its upper ranks. I always often refer to the Islamic Republic as a mafia state. And, in a mafia state, there's no real loyalty to any greater cause. So that thing that would hold a regime together, that sense of loyalty is now gone. You have a deeply, deeply unhappy population that's very angry at this regime and has demonstrated that over and over again by coming out in the streets, courageously fighting, even at the cost of their lives. They've been saying that they don't want this regime anymore. I think you will increasingly see a base for this regime. I mean, this is a regime that probably has somewhere between 10 and 20% support inside the country. And even those people must be looking around and saying, this is a regime that performed very, very poorly in this 12-day war that occurred. So their faith in the regime must be shaken a little bit. And this is a regime that no longer has proxies. Hamas and Hezbollah have been decimated in the past couple of years. So all the elements are there. This is a weakened regime with an angry population ready to overthrow it. All the elements are there for regime change. But there are a couple of things that work in the regime's favor. One is its propensity to use violence, its willingness to use indiscriminate violence to hold on to power. It's demonstrated that at home in the past, and it's demonstrated that through its proxies. So for many years, Bashar al-Assad in Syria held on to power through the help of the IRGC and the Iranian regime, and the way it did it was by just indiscriminately attacking his own civilians. This is something Iran's regime will do. And the second thing that might keep the regime in power is, if the West signs a deal with it, allows the regime to re-access international markets and get capital again, the regime may be able to, give some meager benefits to the public, especially its own base, to keep them happy. So these two things are in tension, but my hope is that over time, the people will win out, but remains to be seen.
If I think back to 5 years ago, and the time and days leading up to October 7th, 2023, Do you think that the leadership in Iran really misplayed their hands? I mean, they had built up Hamas, they had built up Hezbollah, they were, as you say, supporting Assad in Syria. They had the Houthis. They were trying to exert power and influence throughout the region in a way that scared the rest of their neighbors, not just Israel. But since October 7th, Hamas is, as you say, effectively taken out. Hezbollah taken out. Assad's gone. The Houthis aren't exactly what they were. And now they're hanging on for dear life. Did they overplay their hand by allowing Hamas to do what they did on October 7th?
Absolutely. I think October 7th, aside from just the human tragedy and the evil that it was, if you look at it purely from a political perspective, I think it was a gross political miscalculation by Iran's regime and the Islamists in Hamas and elsewhere. They had thought that they would attack Israel. Israel would lob a few missiles back, perhaps take out, a few Hamas fighters here and there, but it would be business as usual. Perhaps they didn't think that the October 7th would be as successful as it ended up being. But whatever it was, I don't think they calculated the wrath of the Israeli public and the desire of the Netanyahu government to engage in this kind of war, to actually stop their policy of so-called mowing the lawn periodically, just taking out some Hamas fighters and living and continuing to live alongside it. They didn't calculate that the policy would change, the doctrine would change, and it would be a wholesale attack on the infrastructure of the Iranian regime and its proxies. And if the regime falls, and I'm hopeful that it will, I think we will look back on October 7th as that decisive date when really the calculation in Jerusalem changed, the calculation in Washington changed, and it became known to a lot of Western leaders that this is not a regime that you can bargain with, that you can sit and negotiate with. This is a regime that has to be overthrown effectively.
Their nuclear program, it has been start and go for a long time. Do you believe that they were close to getting nuclear weapons? I know there are people out there in Western media and society trying to downplay this. Iran was no threat. That was in the Globe and Mail the other day, for goodness sakes. People trying to compare this to Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. What do you know, and what do you believe they were trying to do there?
I think they were trying to develop a nuclear weapons program, and I believe they were close. Now, exactly how close they were they a few weeks away, a few months away? I don't know. Obviously, that's for the experts and the intelligence community to assess. But first of all, I have no doubt that this was a weapons program. The idea this was for civilian use makes no sense. There's no reason why the IRGC needs to keep a secret civilian nuclear program. There is no reason to enrich uranium to the levels that Iran was enriching them at. So certainly there was a desire to acquire nuclear weapons. In terms of how close they were, I don't know. There are different stories about this, but one of the things I find surprising, you mentioned the Globe and Mail, you see this kind of rhetoric in a lot of places, is simply the willingness to give Iran's regime the benefit of the doubt. And I have no idea why so many Western commentators are willing to do that. This is a regime that has lied over and over again about everything under the sun, including the nuclear program, which they kept hidden from the world, and they lied to international monitors. So given a choice between trusting, Western intelligence agencies or the Iranian regime, I'm going to choose the West every time. And I don't know why so many of our commentators fall on the other side.
You've got Syria and Jordan allowing Israel to use their airspace to carry out strikes. You've got Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. I mean, we didn't see him dancing over the strikes, but he was happy. He had said recently how concerned he was about Iran getting a nuclear weapon, and said Saudi Arabia does not want one, but if they get one, we must have one.
Yeah.
So I think that speaks to the level of confidence that everybody except certain Western commentators have on this issue, and why they would believe a regime that shot down a plane full of Canadians in PS 752 and then say, oh, well, I mean, that was a mistake. I mean, no, this is a bloodthirsty regime that has carried out terrorism around the world while oppressing their own people.
That's absolutely true. The most hardcore supporters of this regime, aside from a few in and around Tehran, seem to be at the think tanks of Washington, D.C. and and Brussels and certain university faculties. Anyone that has had contact with this regime, including other countries in the region, know what a threat it is. This is a regime that has tried from day one for 46 years. When it came to power, it has tried to destabilize every government in the region. It has needlessly gotten itself involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, that's a conflict that does not implicate Iranian national interests at all, and yet Iran's regime has been front and center in that fight. It makes no sense. It has fought the Saudis. It obviously was in a war with Iraq. I mean, that was a war that Iraq, in fairness, started, but it was very involved in the war in Syria. Anytime there is conflict in the region, Iran somehow seems to be part of it, and all those governments are looking around saying, well, we would be better off and the region would be much more peaceful without Iran's regime. And increasingly, these are governments that have gotten comfortable with the state of Israel. They've signed the Abraham Accords. They're ready to structure a different sort of life in the Middle East. And yet Iran remains the holdout. It's still the one shouting death to Israel, death to America. And, it would love nothing more than to kind of establish that Shia dominance throughout the region.
How badly do you think those mobs, the mothers of all bombs, damaged Fordow and the other facilities? Obliterated, damaged a bit. Again, this is a matter of open debate.
Yeah, it is a matter of open debate, and I don't know if my view has any more credibility than anybody else's. I mean, I'm reading in the same newspapers. Really, it's for the intelligence community to assess. My feeling, though, is that the regime probably anticipated there were going to be attacks on its nuclear facilities. It may have moved equipment away. It may have moved some of the enriched uranium away. So until such time that Israeli and Western intelligence agencies say that this program is done and it's been destroyed, and it doesn't look that way, certainly based on the reporting in the New York Times and elsewhere, I'm not comfortable. I feel that this is a regime that is going to pursue nuclear weapons, and if it's centrifuges are damaged now, it will try to set up shop elsewhere and do it. For them, I think, for the Iranian regime at this point, now knowing that Israel is willing to attack them and how much superiority in terms of power, military power Israel has, I think it's become an existential issue for Iran's leaders now. So I think they're going to, if they've been able to preserve anything from those nuclear sites, they're going to race to get a bomb as quickly as they can.
What is it that drives them to want that nuclear bomb, to get involved in all of these other wars? I've listened to people say, well, it's a specific subsect within Shia Islam, and they have a very end times worldview. Do you put stock in that?
The Iranian regime is an amalgam of different things. There are some people that have this messianic religious outlook.
The Twelvers.
The Shia Twelvers, yeah, that refers to 12 imams that they believe in that followed the Prophet Muhammad. So there are some of them. There's some true believers. If you go back 46 years to when the revolution happened, I think there were a lot of true believers. Over time, a lot of that belief, I think, among the upper echelons has fallen away, but some of them still believe this stuff. But I think for the vast majority of the regime apparatchiks and high-ranking officials, I continuously refer to Iran as a mafia state. They want to hold on to power, and for them, the nuclear bomb is the thing that basically serves as a guarantee that they will not be overthrown because the foreign governments will be afraid of them. They feel that if they can frighten away the rest of the world, they will be able to keep a lid on things at home through sheer repression.
No one's trying to invade Iran. No one's threatening Iran, not since the war you said with Iraq. But it's not like Saudi Arabia says, it would be great, let's go over and take them over. I mean,
it is a bit of a bizarre calculation on their part. I mean, had they not pursued this program, they would not have been in this kind of conflict with the world, I don't think.
And they'd have a lot of money to,
and they would have a ton more money.
Programs the public would be happy about.
Absolutely. So I don't know kind of what is motivating this, but I feel like this has been part of the ideology of this regime from day one. This feeling perpetuated over and over again that they're isolated in the world, that they're under threat from governments in the region. The Saudis tend to be a favored villain of theirs. And Israel certainly. And now that they're in this path, they don't feel safe. They feel like other regimes are going to try to topple them. Obviously, they have the experience of having watched what happened to the Shah. They themselves were involved in the toppling of the Shah, so they would like some guarantees in terms of their ability to continue to rob the country blind.
Part of this isolationist idea, would it be that because Iran is mostly Persian, not Arab, mostly Shia, not Sunni, it's a difference, among the neighbors? Is that part of it?
I suspect that plays into it. I don't know if the Persian versus Arab matters as much to the clerics. The clerics don't tend to think in nationalistic terms, though interestingly, in the last little while, in order to mobilize people against Israel and the United States in the last few days, if you look at the broadcasts from Iran, you'll see a lot more references to Persian mythology and, Iran, the motherland, and that kind of stuff. But by and large, over the life of this regime, it has not been a nationalistic regime. It doesn't think, the clerics don't think in those terms. Exactly. They're theocratic, and they think of their people as the Shia Muslims, not the Iranian population. And so I suspect that the Shia-Sunni divide is a really big issue for them, and that explains probably one of the major reasons for conflict with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Iran is sort of thought of as the Shia center, and Saudi Arabia is the Sunni center of the Muslim world. And so that conflict, I suspect, psychologically probably matters a lot to Iran's leadership.
All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about where leaders may emerge from in the coming days and weeks.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Hi, this is Joe from Vanta. In today's digital world, compliance regulations are changing constantly, and earning customer trust has never mattered more. Vanta helps companies get compliant fast and stay secure with the most advanced AI, automation, and continuous monitoring out there. So whether you're a startup going for your first SOC 2 or ISO 27001, or a growing enterprise managing vendor risk, Vanta makes it quick, easy, and scalable. And I'm not just saying that because I work here. Get started at vanta.com.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
There were a lot of precision strikes carried out by Israel in the 12-Day War, and Kaveh, I want to ask you about one in particular, a prison for political dissidents. We don't have such things in Canada, mostly because we don't tend to put political dissidents in prison, not often anyway, but they wouldn't have their own prison anyway. Did people get out of this? Do we know if there were significant political dissidents that were able to escape because of this strike?
To my knowledge, nobody managed to escape. So the Israelis carried out a bombing. It seemed to be a symbolic bombing of the sort of the front door of Evin prison, the notorious prison where a lot of dissidents are kept.
Pretty badass.
Look, I have to say, on initial viewing of the video, I was really ecstatic. The symbolism was awesome. Mind you, subsequently, some news got out. A lot of the prisoners themselves said they were very frightened that the conditions in the prison got very bad. So perhaps as a practical matter, it wasn't that great to do that. I know that the regime very quickly seemed to gather its forces, put all the prisoners in buses, and I think took them to other places. But that is symbolically, I go back to this, psychologically, I think it matters a lot to blow up the door of Evin prison. It really opens up the mind to the possibilities of what would happen if many of those prisoners were back and able to be politically active again.
Well, there's a whole mythology in France surrounding the Bastille.
Yeah.
So that goes back a long way. We talked briefly about the opposition earlier. There is one gentleman who I know some people say, well, he should just become the leader. He's the son of the former king. Is it Reza?
Reza Pahlavi.
Yes. So you had a long thread on X the other day about this. You're not a fan. Tell us who he is, why he matters, and why you don't think he's the right guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of your listeners of Iranian background aren't going to like this, but let me do my best. So Reza Pahlavi is a 64-year-old man who lives in Maryland, where he's lived most of his life. And for much of his life, he has spoken about wanting to establish democracy in Iran, wanting to play a role in establishing democracy in Iran. And he sort of met with different political leaders and said a lot of the right things. So I actually was a fan up until fairly recently. I had the opportunity to meet with him a couple times. Everything he said sounded good to me. He seemed like he had really internalized democratic ideals in the West. But what happened was there was a protest movement a couple of years ago, you may recall, which people often refer to as the Woman Life Freedom Movement. And as a result of that, there was a real push inside Iran and also outside in the diaspora to sort of create an opposition coalition. And Mr. Pahlavi was part of that coalition. There was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, Ms. Shirin Ebadi, that was part of that coalition. We had a famous prominent women's rights activist, Masih Ali-Nejad, part of that. We had a gentleman from Toronto whose loved ones were killed on PS 752, and he had sort of been an outspoken critic of the regime, and he sort of represented the constituency of a lot of people that whose loved ones had been hurt by this regime, tortured, executed, and what have you. So it seemed to be an interesting coalition, and yet under pressure from the sort of the, I would argue, the far right, or at least his supporters, his extreme nationalist supporters, Mr. Pahlavi effectively blew up that coalition, and he walked away, and the coalition fell apart very quickly, and I think didn't last even a month. And since then, his supporters have gone on a tear for the past couple of years and attacked all other opposition figures. Anyone that does not bend the knee to Mr. Pahlavi and doesn't accept him as the leader of the opposition, they have attacked. They have called them supporters of the regime. They've said, you're just in it for the money. You're trying to get funds for your activities and so on. And it's been a real problem. So Mr. Pahlavi hasn't actually expanded his base. If anything, he has, I think, in my view, shrunk his base. So there are a lot of opposition people that maybe a couple of years ago would have been willing to work with him, would have been willing to get in a coalition with him, and I don't think they would any longer be willing to do that. And so much of politics is about building bridges and building building coalitions.
Well, what I like to say is politics is about addition, not subtraction.
That's exactly right, and that has not been the attitude of Mr. Pahlavi's team. Now,
but there are some. I've seen messages from his hardcore supporters. They don't want him to go in and establish democracy. They want him to go in and reestablish the monarchy.
Yeah, some of his supporters. I mean, if you and they often say this not in English, but in Farsi, which I think is an important point. In English, they tend to say often all the right things. They say, he's going to be a transition leader. He's going to be, setting up a democratic system, and then he'll walk away from power or whatever. In Farsi, when you start to read it, they're like, no, we want him in charge, and we want to return to the pre-revolution times, where I admit, pre-revolutionary Iran was much, much better than what it is now, but it was not politically free. His father ruled with an iron fist for many years, and he created the conditions for this revolution. So Mr. Pahlavi has not, I don't think, reassured the public and the rest of the opposition that he is interested in true liberal democracy. Even though the rhetoric is liberal democratic, the behavior of his supporters, and especially his sort of inner team, his few advisors around him, that behavior has not been reassuring. And I think a lot of people, women's rights activists, human rights activists, have their concerns about him. The ethnic minorities in Iran, like the Kurds, for example, which are politically powerful and they're large in number, they are very concerned. And so, I think the feeling was if this 12 war continued and the regime was toppled, the Israelis would probably back Mr. Pahlavi to take power. Now that Israeli attack has stopped, the feeling is that Mr. Pahlavi may have overplayed his hand. Maybe he thought he was more powerful than he actually is. And if there is going to be a future iteration of a coalition, it may not include him because he has not been democratic in outlook. I still think that he still has a constituency in Iran. He cannot be ignored, but I really hope that he changes his ways and he focuses, as you say, on addition rather than subtraction.
So if he were to change his ways, build a coalition, bring in different parties, factions, and work towards a democratic Iran in the future, you wouldn't have a problem with that. You just don't see him doing that at the moment.
Absolutely not. I mean, I was encouraging a lot of my friends who were not monarchists, who were distrustful of him. A couple of years ago, I was encouraging them to, sit down with Mr. Pahlavi. I helped organize a virtual meeting with him. I persuaded some of the folks I tried to persuade some of the folks that got into a coalition with Mr. Pahlavi. They were reluctant to do it, but I said, this needs to be done. So I don't have a problem with him personally. I don't even have a problem. My choice is not a constitutional monarchy. I would like to see the future Iran be a republic. But
a non-Islamic republic.
A non-Islamic republic, certainly. But there's nothing undemocratic about a constitutional monarchy. I mean, I live in Canada, and this is a perfectly democratic country, and it's a constitutional monarchy. So I don't have a problem with that. What I do worry about is a return to pre-revolution Iran, where you have a king who is effectively an authoritarian leader. Even if benevolent, it's still authoritarianism, and that's not what I want to see in a future Iran.
Are there other blocs, factions, groups, parties that are out there? I doubt that you could easily do a comparison. Well, here's the New Democrats in Iran, and here's the liberals, and here's the conservatives, and we've got a Bloc Québécois too. I doubt you could do that. But can you help listeners in Canada that aren't familiar with Iran understand who the different parties and factions are? Is it along a left-right divide, such as that is, or is it along other lines of demarcation?
Yeah, it's not as clear-cut as just left, right, and center. So one thing to keep in mind is that Iran is made up of a lot of different ethnic groups, and probably the most organized among them are the Kurds. Now, the Kurdish parties, some of them are separatists, we have to admit, and some of them just want a little bit more autonomy in a future free Iran. And regrettably, I would say, to go back to our discussion of Mr. Pahlavi, his supporters have not been willing to distinguish between those two, and they sort of view all Kurdish groups with suspicion. They think all of them are separatists. So, some of the breakdown in our opposition is along ethnic lines. Some of it is along the lines of Republican versus monarchists or constitutional monarchist. There are still remnants of the old Iranian left, dating back to the 60s and 70s, and they're sort of a radical left. And I find them personally distasteful, and I think their ideas are really out of date. But they definitely exist. But in terms of organized parties, regrettably, there are not many. But there are individuals here and there who can take a leadership role, or at least be part of a coalition of figures with political views.
We've all, I've seen, I'm sure many others listening have seen those before and after photos of Tehran, before the Islamic Revolution and after. I understand your concerns about the political freedoms during the pre-revolutionary times, but in other ways, it was a very free country. It was a very forward-looking country, perhaps more Western than some would like, but it was prosperous, it seemed. It seemed like things were on the go. Would Iran be able to get back to that under different leadership? Would it be a prosperous country, a place where someone like me might say, you know what, let's take a trip to Tehran?
Yeah, I have no doubt that Iran could be that. Iran has vast natural resources. Iran has a population that's very well educated. That's unlike a place like North Korea, which also has an authoritarian regime, Iran's population has not been cut off from the world. They have been watching the West. They've been interacting with the West on the internet, through satellite television, and so on. Many young people in Iran speak English very well. They want to be integrated into the world. And they're very talented. And you see evidence of that by just looking at the success of the Iranian diaspora. So many, doctors, engineers, lawyers, business people have been successful in the West, and those talents can either those folks can either go back to Iran, or it tells you something about the culture that so much there's so much emphasis on education and achievement and so on. So I think that all the ingredients are there. Now, mind you, there's one issue that does worry me about a future Iran, which is this regime for the past 40 years has completely neglected the environment, and some of the damage to Iran's environment may be irreparable. I do worry about that, and there are some experts that say that. But putting that aside, all the ingredients are there for a very forward-looking country, for a very prosperous country, for a country where Brian can come as a tourist and visit, and he would have a great time and would be welcomed by the population. But yeah, I think it really requires a different leadership, and that's something that's been missing for 40 years.
Under different leadership, one not driven by theocratic aims, would Iran get along with Israel? Would there be peace with Israel? I know that you mentioned the story that everyone mentions in your Jerusalem Post piece about Cyrus saving the Jews. Would the general population be okay with saying, you know what, we're going to stop attacking those guys. We're just going to live in peace? Yeah,
absolutely. Look, I mentioned earlier that our opposition is fractured, but there is no serious current in our opposition. The people that would replace this regime, there's no serious current that wants conflict with Israel. Everyone from right to left wants peace with Israel. Even the lefties, I think, who have probably more sympathy for the Palestinian cause, they ultimately think of it as not a national issue, but they have sympathies and they want the Palestinians better treated, but they don't want Iran to be involved in a conflict with Israel. So yeah, I think a different leadership in Iran, assuming there's not civil war and general chaos, any democratic government in a future Iran would be willing to make peace. And you see that in the general population as well. There are videos that come out of, let's say, soccer stadiums where the Iranian regime at the beginning of the war in Gaza would bring out Palestinian flags, and you would see tens of thousands of people. And excuse my language here, they would start shouting in a rhyme in Persian, take your Palestinian flag and shove it up your ass. Like, that's the general sentiment. And it's not, I don't think of that as anger at the Palestinians. I think of that as anger at a regime that has gotten Iran so caught up in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, far beyond what our national interest may be.
You mentioned or did a quick comparison to North Korea. Give us a quick sense of what daily life is like in Iran. Do you have freedom to go around shopping, doing your own things, regular foodstuffs, or is the government controlling everything?
Yeah, so some of that will depend on how wealthy you are and how connected you are. So if you live in northern Tehran and you are quite wealthy and perhaps your family has ties to the regime, you can live a pretty comfortable life in Iran. You still have to, if you're a woman, pretend to put on a hijab, even though increasingly even that seems to be optional, or not optional, but it's the rules are not enforced as harshly in certain parts of the country. So you can live a life of relative comfort and luxury if you're wealthy. But for the rest of the country, it's a very different life. The economy is collapsing. A lot of young people are not able to get jobs. They have no hope for the future. They're putting off marriages because they simply will not be able to afford, having their own home, raising kids, and so on. And the regime inserts itself not just in the economy, not just in politics, but in every element of everyday life. So aside from those small zones where the government doesn't, for example, enforce the hijab rules, if you're a woman in Iran, you are constantly worried about what you're wearing. A choice as personal and as intimate as what you wear is dictated by the regime. If you're a young person walking down the street with, let's say, your girlfriend or your boyfriend, you could have some thugs from the regime stop you in the middle of the street, ask you, what you're doing, what your relationship is, and if, you're not married and you're holding hands, you could actually end up getting whipped. That's the kind of fear that people live in. If you have a party, then you've got Western music playing, and if you've got alcohol, and a lot of people do this, the authorities could show up and break it up and again take you to jail, and you could be lashed for having just these very basic freedoms. So actually online for a few years there was this online campaign of people with the hashtag normal life. Like, all people want is just to be able to live the normal life that people in the West live. The very, very basic things that you and I take for granted. Every day we wake up and we decide what we can wear, what we want to wear. We decide, who we want to spend time with, if we want to have our friends over, and what we would serve at our party. All these choices are, in technically speaking, controlled by the government, and you run a risk by just living a basic normal life.
Well, hopefully that changes for the people of Iran, and hopefully one day, before it's too late for me, I will get to visit Tehran, because it is one of the places that I would love to see. Kaveh, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Brian.
Full Comment is a Post-Media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, on Amazon, Spotify, wherever, Apple, of course, and help us out by leaving us a rating, giving us a review. Until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I promised you. But the late 1960s, you have members of the Montreal police who can spend their entire shift rushing from one FLQ bombing to another. Here's how New Year's Eve 1968 played out for Robert Cote, a member of the Montreal Police Bomb Squad, which put him at the forefront of fighting the FLQ during this period. He was supposed to be at home with his wife, who had just miscarried twin daughters, but instead, at 11 p.m., he's called out to Montreal City Hall to investigate a bomb that had just gone off. He's en route with sirens blaring when he's told, "Actually, don't bother with the exploded bomb. There's an unexploded bomb on the other side of City Hall you have to defuse." And then, right after snipping the wires on the City Hall bomb, Cote has to speed west, where a third bomb has just exploded outside a federal building.
The bombing started in April and May of 1963. That's when the first bombings took place. And the mailbox bombings were the most famous part of the whole thing, which was basically on the Thursday night and Friday night leading into the Victoria Day weekend in 1963. So, and initially they started attacking these symbols of federalism, federal institutions, whether it was the Montreal Post Office or Revenue Canada. But the bombings escalated as time went on in terms of the size of the bombs and the powerfulness of these bombs.
If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.